Hello guys and gals, and welcome to another episode of Skills and Abilities. Today we're going to be going over a weird one. Last episode we went over the amazing freezing arrow, and this episode we're going to be going over the weirdo cold arrow. Cold arrow is a physical damage skill. I know that sounds weird when I say it, but it's a physical damage skill. It's not an elemental damage skill. What Cold Arrow does is it converts a portion of your physical damage into elemental damage. As you can see at level 20, or rather level 38, it is 77% physical damage to elemental damage conversion. It also adds some cold damage on top, so you do get a nice little additional cold damage of 319 to 336. And if you beef up its synergy, which is Ice Arrow, it does go up to a healthy 1084 to 1142. But the thing is that this particular skill doesn't really do very much damage. If you take a look at my physical damage right now, I am currently at 111 to 1472. This, of course, can be increased by pumping points into dexterity. If I wanted to just dump a whole bunch of points into dex, you'll see now I'm at 302 to 4,311 physical damage. Now, I do have a little bit of elemental damage coming from the ring, but for the most part, that is entirely physical. Now, if I switch over to Cold Arrow, you will notice that Cold Arrow doesn't really go up that much in terms of like damage output. In fact, if we subtract that 1,000 from the equation, you will see that it actually is pretty close to the 4,311. It just has that 1,142 added to it, which is on the actual skill. So 77% of my physical damage, which is 4,311, is being converted into elemental damage, which means I'm left with a paltry. Let's do a quick calculation on that. So 4,311 minus 77%. We're looking at about 990 damage left on our attack there that is actually still physical. And this is important because the physical damage component is what is being used to steal mana. It's what's being used to steal life. If I'm not dishing out any physical damage, I'm not getting any steal back, basically. Now, this is actually affected by things like Critical Strike, so we would definitely want to beef up Critical Strike for something like Cold Arrow, as high as humanly possible. It also requires physical hits, so we're most likely going to want to beef up our Penetrate, and we definitely want a pretty good level of Pierce. And the reason why we're going to be doing all this is because, well, it is first and foremost a physical damage skill. So we get this huge physical damage component in the beginning, which is then converted into other things. And if we crit, that crit is also converted into damage. So let's say, for instance, our 4,311, which is what we have right now for physical damage, ends up getting multiplied by 2. We get 8,622, and then we subtract 77% of that as elemental damage, which means we have 6,638 cold damage with an additional 1,938 physical damage. So if we actually go and take this out into somewhere and shoot some stuff, let's go to River of Flame real quick. You'll see that there's some other issues with the ability. The first off is it has a relatively small range. Let's use Hadriel as our comparison here, and I'm going to show you that as far as he is concerned, firing our shot, you'll notice that it disappears about at the first statue. It's really short-ranged for a attack, whereas something like Ice Arrow travels pretty much all the way to Hadriel, about double the distance. I don't know why Ice Arrow, or rather Cold Arrow, has such a short duration and Ice Arrow does not. Duration. The word has left my head at this particular moment. I'm sure I will remember it in a second. But the distance that it goes is just not really that impressive. As you can see right here, I'm having trouble hitting this maggot, like that's kind of like walking in and out of distance. And now the Maw Fiend is also walking in and out of distance, which is definitely very poor in terms of its damage output. If I can't hit a target that's further away than that, what am I even doing on Amazon? Now, this particular game is set up for P8, so you guys can see how well this would work. And Cold Arrow by itself, I mean, it does do some damage. It's not the most amazing thing in the world. I wouldn't call it a density clearing tool or anything, but it certainly seems to pump out a little bit of DPS. And if it was supported with max damage charms, negative cold resistance, and things like that, it could probably do pretty well. As you can see, though, here's some cold immune targets. And despite the fact that this is a physical damage effect, you are still subject to the immunity of the targets that you're fighting. So these cold immunes are basically taking no damage because most of my physical damage is being converted into elemental. If I was on like an elemental or a physical damage attack right now, I could kill these guys pretty much with no trouble. Because most of that physical damage that I'm doing is just being converted, so it's making it a lot harder for me to actually kill stuff. In fact, even if I was using something like Ice Arrow actually doesn't convert physical to elemental, and so Ice Arrow would again allow me to dish out damage regardless of what I'm shooting. These poor little grotesques don't even stand a chance with Ice Arrow. There's another ability that's just like this, or rather two other abilities in this same tree. The first off is Fire Arrow, which also does the physical conversion. And then finally Magic Arrow, which does the physical conversion as well. Now you could potentially make a physical conversion build where you'd have basically all three elements. So you could do something like 20 points in Cold Arrow, 20 points in Ice, 20 points in Magic Arrow, and then something like 20 points in Fire with, 20 points in Exploding. And it's not like a super duper heavy. It's 20, 40, 60, 80, so you'd still have some points left for some other stuff. But basically what this would do would it would allow you to have multiple different conversions of your physical damage into elemental. Now, the kind of the sad thing about Cold Arrow is that Magic Arrow is kind of like insanely better. Not only does Magic Arrow also convert physical damage into an elemental type, it converts it into an elemental type that is more likely to dish out damage than cold or fire. So for instance, in any situation that you come across, you will usually come across situations where nobody is immune to magic. In fact, there's very, very, very few places in the game where monsters are magic immune. And so having an ability like this that can convert your physical damage into magical damage is actually kind of insane, especially at a really high level. As you can see, I'm not really doing that much more damage than how much I'm doing right now, so 302 to 4,311. However, it is converting 79% of all my physical damage into magic, which is honestly superior to the Cold Arrow in just about every way. Because while the Cold Arrow does give me a decent amount of cold damage on top and adds that number on, it's also cold damage, and it's not really that amazing. The other things that the Cold Arrow has is, number one, it has a pretty high mana cost at 8.1 per shot, especially if you're going for a very fast build. And it also has the cold length duration on it, which is fairly long, but it's not the most amazing thing in the world. It's 48.4 seconds, which does get diminished heavily in hell difficulty by about 33%. So most of that ends up going away. And obviously it doesn't work on the cold immunes. But if you were to fire this at a monster that's not cold immune, you'll notice that he does stay chilled for a pretty long period of time. You could just sit here and count it out if you wanted to, but it definitely does keep them chilled for an excessive period. And you can obviously stack that with other pieces of equipment. So if you were using cold charms, the Raven Frost obviously helps that. Any cold damage that you get from any source will stack in there and will help that out. But honestly, with this kind of build, you wouldn't want to stack cold damage. You would want to stack more physical damage. You would want your physical damage to go as high as humanly possible to take advantage of it. And I've dreamed about potentially making like a fire arrow or a cold arrow build, but I just can't really wrap my head around how that would even really work. I feel like any build that would involve maximizing cold arrow or fire arrow would also inevitably max out physical damage. And if you're going to max out physical damage, you might as well just be like a multi-shot, a strafe, Zon, or something like that. Like, I feel like it would be better. And honestly, Magic Arrow seems like a far superior choice in general over top of Cold Arrow and Fire Arrow. Just simply because there's very few monsters in the game that are resistant to it, and if you're going to go down this route, you might as well choose the element that is much easier to deal with. All in all, Cold Arrow is just one of those weird abilities that just doesn't really get used a lot, and I don't really think it's going to change unless they really revamp these skills. I think Cold Arrow and Fire Arrow would need a pretty hefty increase in damage output to even be close to something that people would want to use, and it would definitely have to compete heavily with Magic Arrow, which is just a direct killer of the other two abilities. Like I said, I just can't really see ever utilizing Cold Arrow or Fire Arrow in any situation where I would have the physical damage to actually utilize it, because instead I would probably just use Magic Arrow. Is there anything else to talk about with this ability? I don't really think so. Other than the fact that it requires attack rating to hit the targets, which is also a detriment, whereas Freezing Arrow does not require attack rating because the explosion will go off whether you hit the target or not. You know, things like Guided Arrow don't. Magic Arrow doesn't have any mana cost past a certain level, whereas Cold Arrow and Fire Arrow both have pretty ridiculous mana costs. They were recently reduced, which was great. But like I said before, because of the physical damage conversion, your mana steal actually ends up being so much less that the low mana cost of the ability actually seems kind of insane. Because when you're shooting a target with just, you got 77% of your physical damage has been converted into elemental, and that small amount that's left is trying to leech your mana, it doesn't really sustain you very well. And it's quite sad. Anyway, as always, I do appreciate you guys and gals watching my videos, even when we're talking about a really weird skill like Cold Arrow. And as always, keep watching.